Hey everybody, I'm Zale Mednick, and welcome to the second episode in our two-episode series exploring whether the war in Gaza qualifies as a genocide. In last week's episode, Professor Omer Bartov, who had written an expose in the New York Times, joined the podcast to explain why he felt Israel's actions in Gaza qualify as a genocide. Today, I'm joined by Professor Jeffrey Herf to take a look at the opposite perspective, as he will make his claim that Israel's war in Gaza is not a genocide. The war between Israel and Gaza has been ongoing for close to 2 years. The heinous crimes of October 7th were a shock to Israelis, Jews worldwide, and many people around the world. Since then, as the war has raged on for almost 700 days, Israel has sought to defeat Hamas and get back its hostages. But with this has come a massive price. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have died. While the numbers vary and it's challenging to distinguish Hamas casualties from civilian casualties, there is no denying that many innocent civilians have been killed in the fighting. In an effort to destroy Hamas, Netanyahu's government has pursued a massive ground campaign. Estimates vary, but even conservative approximations would agree that a majority of Gaza infrastructure has been destroyed and that the vast majority of Gazan civilians have had to flee their homes. Food crisis looms with a potential famine on the horizon. Hospitals have been destroyed, and those that still exist are at capacity with limited function. In short, the situation for Palestinian civilians in Gaza has become a living nightmare. But who is to blame for this? Hamas is a known terrorist organization with a history of using their own civilians as human shields, committing awful atrocities as evidenced by October 7th. They have a massive underground tunnel system, which has made it almost impossible for Israel to defeat Hamas without destroying significant amounts of infrastructure in order to access those underground tunnels. Hostages and Hamas members have been hidden in civilian areas, and Israel has had to inflict civilian damage in order to achieve its military goals. Hamas has been extremely difficult to negotiate with. They still have many hostages, and Hamas refuses to surrender or even acknowledge Israel's existence. On the other side of the coin, in Israel's quest to defeat Hamas and get back its hostages, has the country gone too far? Has there been an unacceptable amount of Palestinian civilian casualties in the name of defeating Hamas? And if so, does that classify as genocide, as many in the international community are claiming? While some see the situation in black and white, to many the situation is extremely complex and gray. Over the past few years, I've run several episodes exploring the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from multiple perspectives, those of an Israeli tour guide, a Jewish professor from Harvard, and a Palestinian professor from Brown. They've offered different vantage points on the history that has led to the present conflict. I encourage you to listen to those episodes to better understand Zionism, the history of Israel's creation, the wars of 1948, 1967, and beyond. But now, as claims of genocide mount against Israel for the dire situation that has emerged in Gaza, I felt it was important to do one more set of episodes, exploring these particular charges. Preconceived originated out of a desire to better understand the world and to search for truth. When the status quo says one thing, are we just to believe it, or are we to critically examine it and make the choice for ourselves? I am Jewish, and Israel is a country that has emotional significance to me and to many of the people I know. This is a difficult topic to discuss, but an important one. In this episode and the previous one, I've been joined by two guests to explore the accusation that Israel is committing genocide. On last week's episode, as I mentioned earlier, Omer Bartov backed up his claim that Israel was indeed committing genocide. In today's episode, genocide scholar Jeffrey Herf, who claims that such cries of genocide are unfounded and devoid of any context. Jeffrey Herf is a distinguished professor in the Department of History at the University of Maryland. He studies the intersection of ideas and politics in modern European history, specializing in 20th century German Republic, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and on West and East Germany during the Cold War. All right, Jeffrey Herf, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is obviously a contentious topic. I do lighter episodes on this show as well, but this is probably as heavy as it gets. There's been allegations, as you know, and which I spoke about in the introduction, of genocide against Israel and its actions against Gaza. And I want to start off by getting your definition of, well, I want to start off, I know that you do not view this as a genocide, and I'm curious if you could just walk us through a definition of genocide that was outlined in the late 1940s And then maybe just explain really why you do not believe that these cries that this is a genocide, which have been increasingly prevalent over the last few weeks, are valid.
In the late 1940s, as you know, and during World War II, actually, a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin sought a concept that would be adequate to the events of the Holocaust, and he coined the phrase genocide. The simplest definition of genocide, and the most important one, is the effort to annihilate a particular group of people based upon their alleged racial, religious, or ethnic background through killing them all. And that is exactly what the Nazi regime was trying to do to the Jews of Europe. It tried to kill them all. And it killed 6 million of them, or 5.8, something like that. And that was a genocide. The Nazis intended to murder all the Jews. They announced it publicly that that was their intention. When they were doing it, they said in public that they were exterminating the Jews of Europe. They justified this by claiming that that international Jewry was attempting to murder the Germans. They kept the details of the murders secret, but there was intent, and there was intent to to eliminate Jews from the face of the earth. So the concept of genocide in recent years has succumbed to an inflationary use, so that the boundary between what is a genocide, that is attempting to eliminate an entire group of people by murdering them, has been inflated to include acts that used to be described as acts of war. And that is what is happening in Gaza. Israel is at war in Gaza not to eliminate the civilians of Gaza, not to destroy the Gazans as the Palestine Arabs who live in Gaza as a people. There is no Israeli statement that expresses that intent. There are a number of statements that Israeli politicians made in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, which expressed their justified and perfectly understandable outrage at Hamas and the other terrorist organizations, I might add, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which also participated in the October 7th murders and rapes and tortures and killing and arson and kidnapping and the like. So Israeli politicians understandably expressed their outrage at what Hamas and these other terrorist organizations had done. And then what happened is that various writers and speakers in the West took those statements out of context and suggested that the government of Israel was attempting to murder or commit genocide against all of the people of Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces faced two contradictory tasks in Gaza. One was to defeat Hamas, and the other was to liberate and free the hostages. The problem facing the Israeli military was that the Hamas organization had spent the years from 2007 to 2023 building what military historians may conclude was the most impressive defensive fortifications in the history of warfare, building hundreds of miles of tunnels underground. Hamas' strategy of war was to fight in the midst of civilians, and the political strategy was to use the resulting death and suffering of civilians to win a propaganda war against Israel in the world public. Israel did everything it could and has done everything it could to defeat Hamas militarily and reduce the number of civilian casualties. It has sent warnings of looming military attacks. It has urged civilians to move away from battlefields. It has even, in the early phases, sent telephone calls to apartment buildings to get out of the building because the building was now in the midst of a battlefield. I cannot think of, certainly as an American, the United States Armed Forces did nothing like that in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I can't think of any other military democracy, Canada, Britain, France, that has done anything like that. So if Israel was trying to murder all of the people of Gaza, which is what a genocide is, it should have done none of the things that it has done in this war. It should not have sent any warnings. It should not have created humanitarian zones. It should not have used precision bombs. It should have used inaccurate bombs. But it did all those things. And because of the strategy that Hamas pursued of fighting in the midst of civilians, of locating its headquarters underneath hospitals, in schools, in civilian areas, it ensured that the only way that Israel could defeat Hamas was to fight its way through civilians. And that's what's happened. And that's why, according to Hamas Health Ministry, about 60,000 Gazan civilians have died, though we don't know if that's an accurate figure. So the genocide accusation, the fundamental flaw of the genocide accusation is that it ignores the fact that this is a war and that it was a war begun by an act of aggression, that the aggressor is Hamas, and that the reason that these civilians have died and suffered is because of the strategy of war that Hamas is pursuing. So that is totally and utterly different than what happened to the Jews in Europe during the Holocaust, when they had no state, they posed no threat to anyone, they were utterly defenseless. All of the Nazi propaganda about the Jewish threat to Germany was lies. And in this state of defenselessness, the Jews indeed were slaughtered. So what we have witnessed in the last 2 years is a reversal also of certain realities. Andrew Roberts, a member of the House of Lords in Britain, published a very important report, a October 7th Parliamentary Commission report about what happened on October 7th and 8th. And when you read that report, or when you simply look back on the reports in the Canadian press or American press, that was a genocide that was interrupted by the belated arrival of the Israeli Defense Forces. That was an example of armed forces who intentionally were killing and murdering civilians, raping women, capturing hostages, doing everything they could to destroy Jewish life, Israeli life in the kibbutzim, in the vicinity of Gaza. And yet we have this real attempted genocide, which was stopped only because Israel has an army, that is not discussed, where we have, and on the other hand, we have Israel waging war, which is horrible, and the suffering is terrible, but waging war is not the same thing as engaging in genocide. And the last point, I'm not an international lawyer, so perhaps it's best to leave this to the lawyers, but there are rules of war. uh, such as wearing uniforms, such as not fighting in the midst of civilians, such as not fighting from the basements of hospitals. There are rules of war, but those who accuse Israel of genocide don't seem or don't point out the ways in which Hamas has flouted these rules. So the last point I would make is this, and I'm speaking now as an intellectual and cultural historian, not as a military expert. The genocide accusation rests on very, very old cliches about the Jews. Their murderousness, the threats they pose to children, and these notions of the murderous Jew are deeply embedded in the Gospels, in the Quran. These famous books can be read in different ways, and they have been read, especially the Gospels have been read in different ways. But when people accuse Israel of genocide, it reawakens very old anti-Jewish sentiments in Western culture. And it is an anti-Semitic argument. To me, and I say it's an anti-Semitic argument because that's not the same thing as saying that the people who make the arguments are necessarily anti-Semites themselves. But the structure of the argument of defenseless Palestinians versus murderous genocidal Israelis is an anti-Semitic argument. So I've gone on a bit longer than I intended, but that is, and I just add one last sentence that I've written in the Times of Israel. Perhaps people watching this podcast would want to read it, an article about the diminishing or disappearing agency of Hamas. And I think that is a point that needs to be stressed again and again and again. If Hamas would surrender, this war would end immediately. All of the suffering and the death, it would be over. If it would surrender, release the hostages, the war would end. And then the supposed genocide would also not be taking place.
So there's a lot to unpack there. One thing I would ask, some people would say, I've heard some people make the argument that this war could have ended about a year ago. In May 2024, for example, is one date that I've heard cited, that Hamas was essentially defeated and that there were reasonable deals on the table. I don't know if they were reasonable deals. I'll leave that to you, where the hostages could have been brought back. But Israel has not wanted the war to end because even there's been a question as to the authenticity of the stated goals of defeating Hamas and getting the hostages back, because people say Hamas has already been defeated, and if we wanted the hostages back, there could have been a deal on the table that Israel would have accepted, but they've wanted this war to continue because the real goal of Netanyahu's government goes beyond those stated goals. How would you respond to people who say this war could have ended already if Israel wanted it to have ended, and that Hamas is already essentially defeated?
I'm not a military expert, and I'm not going to voice an opinion about that. As you know, today and yesterday, dozens of former military generals and intelligence officials made the case that Hamas has been essentially defeated and that the war should end, and that there's nothing more that can be accomplished through expansion of the war. I'm not in a position to evaluate who is right about that. I do not. I think that the goal of the war should be to liberate the people of Gaza from Hamas, not to expel them, not to annex it. But here's the dilemma. For any government of Israel, whether it would be Benjamin Netanyahu or Ehud Barak or Yoav Gallant or Benny Gantz, whether a government of the center-left, center-right, before and especially after October 7th, no government of Israel could possibly tolerate the return of Hamas to power in Gaza, because Hamas is committed to destroying the state of Israel. And on October 7th, it illustrated that it is serious about that. So the question facing any Israeli government is what kind of a peace will lead, what kind of an end of the war will lead to peace? And who or what will govern Gaza to prevent a Hamas return? So I am actually in favor of a longer-term occupation of Gaza by Israel, by the Palestinian Authority, perhaps with Egypt, perhaps with United Arab Emirates, so long as there is a path toward an eventual Palestinian governance in Gaza by some kind of political entity that will use force to prevent Hamas from returning to power, and will decide at long last to end this ridiculous and absurd war against Israel and to live side by side with the Israelis. That is going to take a long time. That's not going to happen overnight. And so whether those generals who are so angry at Netanyahu and saying that the war could end, maybe they're right. But the difference between those generals and Netanyahu is not between people who are engaging in genocide and those who are not. It's a difference of how best to bring about a post-war settlement. And certainly Netanyahu has placed himself in a position of depending on far-right ministers whose views I find abhorrent. But what needs to happen in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, and here we have a really ironic moment. The leaders of our countries need to loudly and clearly call on Hamas to surrender, just as the Arab League has. The Arab League has called on Hamas to surrender before the governments of Canada, France, and Britain and the United States have. It's very strange. So, I'm a historian of modern European history who knows a lot about the Middle East, but I'm not a soldier and I'm not a general or an intelligence officer, and I'm not going to be on your podcast and say what I think should or should not happen.
And I appreciate that, and a lot of it comes down to, I guess,
And by the way, neither are a lot of other people who express opinions about it.
needless to say. And I try to refrain from giving my own opinions because I acknowledge I'm getting experts on this podcast to give their opinions, because I'm not an expert in this. I'm just somebody who's trying to understand the truth. One element of the truth that I think is what leads to so much dispute is there are some people who do not believe in the general Israeli ethos, and there are other people who do believe in an Israel that is good, that their policies and administration are not designed to annihilate the people of Gaza, that their goals are as cited, to defeat Hamas and to get the hostages back. There are a lot of people, many of whom claim that this is a genocide, who say, no, Israel is saying that's their goals, but in reality, that's not their goals. And when I look at it, it comes down to, do people trust Israel or do people not trust Israel and what it's saying?
Well, you put your finger on an important issue, which is the legitimacy and credibility of the government of Israel. Because as the day's events take place, there's always a question: who do you believe about this bomb or that picture or this story? Who is telling the truth and who is not telling the truth? Hamas is a terrorist organization that is not responsible to anyone but itself. Israel remains a democracy with a government that is accountable. I come back to the point I made earlier. If anything like October 7th had happened to Canada or the United States or Britain or France or any of the countries which are very loudly denouncing Israel, if anything like that had happened to them, they would be doing exactly what Israel is doing. And many of them would be doing it much worse and more brutally. So the kind of skepticism about Israel that you alluded to sometimes, I think, comes back to a rejection of the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own. And that many young people think, why can't Israel be like Toronto or New York or Berlin or London, and just a lot of different ethnicities and religions, and everybody gets along, and all this stuff is just so old-fashioned. And it would be, but unfortunately, John Lennon's Imagine is not the way the world works. And the Holocaust demonstrated what could happen to the Jews if they didn't have a state of their own. And as long as there are people who believe that the Jews murdered Jesus and that the Jews murdered the prophets, as it states in the Quran, or the Jews run capitalism and communism, as long as people believe these lies, there is going to be anti-Semitism, and there's going to be rejection of the right of the Jews to have a state of their own. There's another reason, I think, that people don't believe Israel. People don't criticize Russia or China or India or Turkey. They don't criticize these countries in part because they're very big. And some of them have a reputation for being very mean. But the thing about Israel is that it's incredibly small. It's like a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the size of Canada. And there are only about 17 million Jews in the entire world of over 8 billion people. So when young idealists present themselves as championing the underdog, what they're doing, in fact, is attacking a very small and vulnerable minority. The notion that Jews lie, that they're clever but they lie, that is also an old anti-Semitic trope. It doesn't help that the far-right ministers say some of the things they do. But before October 7th, for the last 25, 30 years, there have been efforts to delegitimate and undermine the right of Jews to have a state of their own, and to describe Zionism as a form of racism, or Israel as a form of settler colonialism, even though there's no mother country to which the settler colonialists are attached. And when people keep saying things about Israel that are not true, when they repeat things that are false, then as a historian, that reminds me of what anti-Semitism is about. Because anti-Semitism is about telling lies about the Jews. Anti-Semitism, criticism of Israel is not per se anti-Semitic, but is by now a cliche. But when people describe Israel as genocidal or racist or apartheid, and it is none of those things, then it is appropriate to say these are anti-Semitic arguments because they rest on falsehoods.
Some would say that Jews have overly exaggerated this as an existential threat in order to justify kind of any means necessary to achieve their goals in Gaza. How would you respond to that? People who say that the Jews...
Anybody who says that is an anti-Semite. Straight out. Or an idiot. Or someone who doesn't read the newspapers. Or who doesn't pay attention to what actually happened, not only on October 7th, but in the last 16 years, when Hamas was firing thousands of rockets at Israel, when it planted bombs on buses in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's that kind of a statement reflects an astonishing, not astonishing, it reflects an indifference to what happened on October 7th and what would have gone on October 8th and 9th and 10th had it not been for the armed forces of Israel. To say, I mean, I urge people to read the October 7th Parliamentary Commission report, which is online, and to look at the details of what happened when civilian deaths were not a collateral issue, they were the point. So the most important promise that a government, and especially a democratic government, gives to its citizens is that it exists in order to defend their lives, their happiness, and their security. And the government of Israel on October 7th failed that promise. But there is no question that any government in the world that is at all decent would have responded to this act of aggression and terror in the way that Israel had, probably even worse than the way that Israel has. So the comment that you referred to implies that what happened on October 7th and 8th did not happen, or that somehow Israel invented it or used it as a pretext. And people who say that kind of thing have not looked at the realities of what happened.
Or heard the explicit comments from Hamas saying they want to annihilate all Jewish people in Israel.
Let me speak a little bit as a historian of the Holocaust. I'm gonna recall a very famous story, which perhaps you know. In 1943, the leader of the what was called the Reich Security Main Office, which most people know as the SS, was Heinrich Himmler, and Himmler gave a secret speech in Posen, Poland, to high-ranking officers of the SS. And he said, I'm not quoting directly, "We have seen, you have experienced, you know what it is like to murder hundreds of Jews. And we are engaged in an act which will save Germany and Europe from this terrible peril, but we must never speak about it. We must never speak about it. I will speak about it here, so we all know." The Nazis did their best to keep the Holocaust as secret as possible. They announced to the world their intentions, but the details they kept secret. On October 7th, the Nukba units of Hamas that invaded Israel literally videotaped their murders and rapes and burnings and kidnappings. They literally videotaped and then put it on the internet, and they were proud of what they were doing. I don't know of anybody in history who has done that, who has engaged in sadism and murder and then broadcast it with pride on the internet. So if people want to talk about genocide, then they should look at those videos. They should look at that young man who's talking to his mother on the phone and said, "Mom, I just murdered 10 Israelis. Isn't that fantastic?" And she says, "Oh, I'm so proud of you, son." Who does that? That's historically unprecedented.
Yeah, that's one of the toughest videos to watch, or I just heard the audios of it. I want to ask you one last question, Jeffrey, and I'm not sure if you might say you're not qualified to answer this because on many levels it's a moral question, and I don't have an answer for it, and few people do. You said before a line that I really liked. On October 7th, civilian deaths were not a collateral issue, they were the point. Having said that, though, obviously there have been tens of thousands of Palestinians who have died as collateral, so to speak. And one question that I think many people struggle with, not everybody, but many people struggle with is, let's put the genocide talk aside for a second and say this is not a genocide, this is just war with horrendous consequences. At what point do the ends not justify the means? At what point do the goals of defeating Hamas and even getting the hostages back, at what point do you say too many innocent civilians have died as collateral damage and we just can't accept that?
Well, this is a war, and Israel is trying to win the war. So the first question is, who do you want to win this war, Israel or Hamas? Hamas's strategy to win this war is to use the deaths of civilians to mobilize world public opinion so that Israel will be compelled to stop the war and Hamas can survive. It's entirely possible that the war should be ended, that Israel can do no more effective demolition of Hamas's military capacities than it already has. You know, 600,000 German civilians were died under British and American aerial attacks in the course of the Second World War. 600,000. And the German Air Force was destroyed in the process as it tried to defend the country. It was their Air Force was shot out of the skies, and that was a very important aspect of winning the war. Your question is, I want you to think about it as if you were the Prime Minister of Israel. Whether you were right of center or left of center, and to ask the question, how can this war end in a way that will ensure peace in the future? The only thing I'm certain of is that Hamas must not have any role in the political life of Gaza after this war is over. And I say that also as a historian of modern German history, because what happened after World War II in Europe was that the Allies made sure that the Nazi Party was destroyed and it would never have, or not never, at least for decades and decades, not have any role in the politics of either West or East Germany. So that's the goal. And when the war can be ended, clearly the continuation of the war now is producing outrage mostly at Israel, certainly among liberals in Canada and the United States and Europe. But those liberals don't have the responsibility of creating a post-war order between Israel and Gaza that is stable and that will bring about peace in the decades to come. So I don't want to say more than that. I think whatever can bring about that kind of a post-war order needs to be done. And I would add, and this refers again to the genocide accusation, there The question that faces Israel is, was the attack of October 7th a Gazan national project? Or was it a project carried out by Hamas? Is there, as we say in Europe, there was an other Germany after 1945? Is there an other Gaza? Is there a different Gaza? Are there Gazans who don't want any more of this religious fanaticism, who want to live side by side with Israel? And let's find out. Let's see if they're there. And if the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Jordanians want to help, then fine. Or the Americans, whatever. But Israel needs to be also part of that post-war order in Gaza, at least for a while. So hopefully, in the long run, this will lead to a Palestinian government that rejects the policy of war with Israel and finally decides to accept the two-state solution. But that is going to take quite a while.
Well, Jeffrey Herf, thank you so much for joining me and providing your insight, your historical insight, and all the research and expertise you have in genocide studies. And you've done more than just talk about genocide. You've just talked about the context of this war in general and how it relates to prior wars and what kind of perspective that can give us. And I'm really delighted that you joined me on Preconceived.
Yeah, let me add that for readers who find this of interest, that last year I published a collection of my essays called Three Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, and Islamist with Routledge. And that's a mixture of scholarly articles about modern German history and then some political essays of political commentary, rather.
And I'm going to put that link into the episode notes so people can read that.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Doctor. And I like it when people call me professor, and so I think if you're a doctor, it's nice to be called doctor.
Then I should be calling you Professor Herf.
Yeah. People, I don't think people come into your office and say, "Hey, Zale, how you doing?"
Some do. I don't mind it. I don't mind it when they do at all. But
okay, well, you're a nice guy.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Herf, for joining me on another episode of Preconceived. And thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Preconceived. Have a great day.